If you want to be a change maker and make your mark on the world, you can do a lot worse than look at how some of the people who shaped the world in the past did what they did. Learn from their successes, learn from their failures. In this video, we look at the extraordinary example of US President number 1 and hero of the War of Independence, George Washington. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for change makers. George Washington was a remarkable historical character. And it's beyond question that had he not been put in charge of the war against the British, America wouldn't have won its independence when it did. Now, it would have become independent at some point, because that's the way that history eventually went for all nations. But it wouldn't have been independent at that point, when you had characters of the calibre of the Founding Fathers creating a unique constitution based on the best system of governance that they could devise to counteract the inevitable weakness and corruption of people. America would be independent, but it would be a very different America to the one today. I think there are 10 lessons that an ambitious changemaker today can learn from the example of George Washington. So let's go through them. The first 3 come down to the bit that we most often neglect in our impatient, urgent, do-it-now world, which is preparation and training. 1. Train yourself to be the person who will be effective in making the change. In his earlier years, Washington assiduously studied to become better educated than his position might have expected. It was his seriousness in that regard that drew the attention of Colonel Fairfax, who first took an interest in helping him further his career. When he became involved in the military, he got all of the books he could find pertaining to military strategy and tactics. When he was focusing on being a farmer, he searched widely for anything and everything he could learn about the type of land they had in that part of America and how it could be better utilised than was then the norm. Had he not done those things, then he would never have been the person trusted to take the lead when the situation demanded. And even if he had been, well, he probably wouldn't have been successful. In order to change the world, you have to have the knowledge about how the world works and how to change it. 2. Join things and become a part of the society you want to change. Amongst your skill sets, you need to know how to build effective relationships with people and to be influential. And there's no one way to do this, but understanding the power of your connections and your network is key to maximising the amount of change you can make in the world. Washington made sure that he projected himself into society, and he became a member of various groups whose aims he felt aligned with his values. That included, for instance, the Freemasons, which in its early incarnation didn't have the controversy associated with it that maybe it does today. He supported the purpose of Freemasonry, to promote the happiness of the human race. But, it was probably about the networking. Washington certainly paid a lot of attention to establishing his reputation and defending it, and his success in that ultimately paid dividends later on. If he'd been around today, he would have recognised what he did in the phrase, build your network before you need it. 3. Learn to keep your emotions in check as a key to making better decisions. Washington was famously unflappable and calm under fire. But he didn't start off that way. As a young man, he was fiery and passionate. Inspired by his mentor, Colonel Fairfax, he deliberately trained himself to become the master of his emotions. And this was absolutely key. When you have bad news piling on you in relentless wave after wave, as he often did as general in the War of Independence, and as he often did as president of a fledgling United States, you're going to be less effective if you're emotionally fragile about how awful it all is. Clarity of thought, when the pressure is on, is a quality that will help you in many situations. Even if the situations are very different in the modern era to the ones Washington faced, the principle's the same. Okay, those are the 3 that had to do with preparation and training. The next 4 are about the heat of a battle. 4. See the battleground clearly and understand your opponents. Washington was very active in trying to get spies into the British camp, so that he could get good intelligence about how they were thinking and what they were immediately planning to do. Many of the things that went most disastrously wrong during the war came about when he didn't have that, and therefore made incorrect assumptions about the enemy's intentions, and his people paid the price in blood. In the controversies of today, you see so many people demonising those who disagree with them and refusing to see events except through a highly selective filter. And that's fine if you're just in this for a recreational thing with people who share the same opinions as you. But if you actually want to change the world, you have to understand what's happening in it, and that means understanding the people in it. And be aware, because half of the information out there is misinformation designed to mislead you. 5. Understand that how the change is achieved is as important as achieving the change in the first place. During the War of Independence, Washington was incredibly sensitive about the principle that in the republic they were aiming to create, the military was subservient to and got its power from the democratically elected government. Well, that sounds obvious to our modern ears, but it wasn't the norm at the time. The norm at the time would have been that the successful general in such a war would have become monarch or emperor. Indeed, towards the end of the war, there were a number of people urging Washington that for the good of the country, he should agree to take exactly that role. Everybody knew that he was so idolised that should he have chosen to do so, the country would have accepted it, probably gladly. Washington, however, was pretty clear that was never going to happen. It wasn't just about winning independence. It was about establishing from the start the principles and values that would shape the society they were going to create. Because if you didn't do that, you just changed the name of the king and everything else would stay the same. Which, of course, was the outcome of so many revolutions throughout history. And it was a concern that followed Washington through his presidency, because remember, he was the first one. Every decision they made was setting a new precedent. Every conflict between the executive and the legislature, they weren't just making a decision, they were establishing how conflicts like that would be resolved in the future. Now, lesser people would have simply used whatever mechanisms they could get away with to get the outcome they wanted. And you kind of see that all the time in our modern politics. Washington wanted to bequeath a system that worked. How things are done, just as important as what's done. 6. Expect resistance to change. And by this, I don't just mean the British fighting in the war. I mean the rivals within the government and within the military who tried to undermine his leadership in order to promote their own. I mean that once he became president, the factions that created politically motivated newspapers that spread lies and cynicism about his every action in the most aggressive way possible. If you're going to change something of substance, there will be people who feel threatened or who are jealous or who just plain disagree with your proposed solutions. And heck, they may even be right to disagree. Knowing when to fight and when to listen is also a key skill for a change maker. You should expect and welcome that people will fight back. You should plan for it, use it to challenge your solutions to make them better, and then understand how you can win the battles. Washington was frankly a lucky general who survived his weaknesses as a military strategist by and large, but he was a very skilled politician, and it enabled him to see off all of the challenges to his path in the end. 7. Focus on all of the factors that affect the outcomes. In terms of the obstacles to Washington's success in the war, it wasn't just about the enemy, and it wasn't just about the internal rivals. Washington's biggest challenge was the total lack of resources that the individual states were prepared to give him to support the troops under his command. He had to try and hold the forces together through winters where they were literally starving, and to do so by maintaining discipline and not allowing them to go stealing and raiding food and supplies from nearby citizens. Most of us would have thrown up our hands in despair and simply concluded if the states couldn't be bothered to support the struggle, then why the heck should we? Or we would have simply lost control of the men and ended up with no army as they deserted and went back to their homes. Another big challenge was keeping the troops healthy. There were frequent outbreaks of deadly diseases such as smallpox, and the conditions they lived in just made it worse. Washington realised he needed to ensure his troops were inoculated against smallpox, which was a bigger deal then than it was now because it would incapacitate them for a period as they developed a milder attack from the disease. But he reasoned that if he didn't, his forces were likely to be devastated. He understood, in other words, his task wasn't just leading the charge against the enemy, it was conquering all of the factors that affected the outcome. Very rarely when we're thinking about bringing a change to the world, a big one anyway, do we consider all of the factors that need to be aligned in order to make it happen, rather than just those immediately in front of us. That brings us to the final three, which I've grouped under the theme of winning the peace. 8. Don't hold grudges or become too partisan to be pragmatic in creating the new reality. Once he became president, Washington quickly realised that it would be far better for the young American nation to have a good trading relationship with the former colonial power Great Britain. And he was also pretty concerned about what was happening in France, the country that had been America's ally, but was engaged with its own revolution that was, well, clearly going in a rather different direction. Now, he navigated the politics of that situation well, to America's benefit. A less aware leader would have simply maintained enmity to the old enemy and loyalty to the former ally, regardless of what was happening in the world that was changing that dynamic day by day. 9. Don't believe your own PR, especially when you've been successful. Washington had the adulation of the nation for his wartime role, and that largely survived his time as president as well. He worked very actively to avoid allowing it to influence how he saw himself. It meant that once he was president, he made himself available to people to talk to them and to hear what they thought. He went on long, arduous tours around the country in order to make that the case. At no point did he adopt the arrogance and self-aggrandizement that some of his peers did. And that was one of the reasons he made so few missteps later on, as he took time and consulted widely in order to make good decisions. And finally, number 10, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That may sound like a non-controversial principle at first listen, but it's almost always controversial because we're often talking about deeply moral questions, and people always disagree on what are the bounds of what can be achieved. Washington calculated that getting the Constitution to work, having it be successfully operated for an initial extended period, was essential to making it stick. There were some who wanted anti-slavery to be a key part of the founding Constitution. Washington agreed that slavery needed to come to an end, even though, in common with some of his peers, he held some himself. But he realised that at that point, creating a United States would simply not be achievable if that was its founding principle, because the southern states would just never join it. Indeed, they'd fight actively against it, as we learned later on. And you would therefore never get the critical mass to create the nation in the first place. Now, he felt that abolition of slavery was inevitable, but it was better to achieve what could be done now than to have it blown to smithereens by going for too much too soon. Now, of course, we look back with our modern eyes, knowing that slavery, which had been practiced all over the world up until that point, was and is an unmitigated evil, and today would be so far beyond the line of acceptable, you wouldn't even entertain it. It's easy to look back in ignorance of how the norms that applied at the time constrained the options of the people that were making the changes. Always be controversial. The campaigners of the day, because they are so immersed in the justice and the urgency of their chosen issue, they rarely have the ability to look objectively at what may or may not be possible. The anti-slavery campaigners in Washington's era would have believed that anything less than everything was morally wrong, which of course was true. And we can't say for sure what would have happened if they tried. If the Constitution had been framed accordingly, maybe there would now be two separate countries taking the space of the current United States, one of which abolished slavery early and one of which came to it only later. And who's to say that wouldn't have been as good an outcome? We don't get to play history back with different scenarios until we find the one that works out for the best. All you can do is make your best judgment. The challenge is understanding the important change that will inevitably lead to further change down the line. Want to make something better but can only get so far? Then do what you can to make it transparent. And over time, that transparency will force further reform. In other words, get the system right and the rest will probably follow. Anyway, those are my 10 lessons from the life of George Washington for change makers. Agree, disagree, have better ones of your own? Let me know in the comments below.